$17 million vanished from a quiet North Carolina vault, not through explosions or high-tech hacking, but through something far more unsettling: trust. The Loomis Fargo robbery did not begin with master criminals in tailored suits, but with ordinary people who believed the system would never suspect them. It exposed an uncomfortable truth: the greatest threat to fortified walls is the person holding the keys. Fueled by resentment, ambition, and reckless confidence, this rural heist shattered faith in corporate security and blurred the line between desperation and greed. What followed was not cinematic glamour, but a chain reaction of consequences. Anatomy of an insider threat. The armored transportation industry acts as the physical circulatory system for hard currency, moving billions of dollars out of sight and out of mind every single day. People naturally imagine these regional cash facilities as impenetrable modern fortresses. They picture thick ballistic plating, complex electronic surveillance networks, and heavy steel vault doors controlled by intricate, fail-safe time locks. Society places absolute trust in this physical infrastructure to protect staggering amounts of tangible wealth. Yet, all the reinforced concrete and high-tech security measures in the world mean absolutely nothing if the human being holding the keys is desperate. The integrity of this entire financial system rests on a fragile foundational layer of human reliability. When that human foundation fractures, the resulting collapse is spectacular. In the autumn of 1997, that exact catastrophic failure unfolded at the Loomis, Fargo and Company regional office in Charlotte, North Carolina. At the time, this massive corporation dominated the cash services market, trusted to handle the physical assets for federally insured banks across the entire southeastern United States. The man at the center of this impending collapse was not an international mastermind or a highly trained professional infiltrator. His name was David Scott Gant, a Gulf War veteran who had diligently worked his way up to the highly trusted position of vault supervisor. His daily responsibility was to oversee the logistical movement of literal tons of cash. During a single standard shift, Gant was tasked with managing payloads that frequently exceeded $20 million. The stark reality of his life outside the vault stood in sharp, unsettling contrast to the mountains of currency he handled every day. Despite holding a position that required absolute integrity and the management of unbelievable wealth, the company compensated him with a wage of roughly $8.15 an hour. This extreme, almost absurd disparity between the astronomical volume of wealth he guarded and his own personal financial struggle created a highly volatile psychological environment. Gant was intimately familiar with the operational rhythm of the facility. He knew the specific blind spots of the surveillance cameras, and he understood exactly how to manipulate the vault time locks. His escalating personal debt and professional dissatisfaction were a dangerous combination that corporate security protocols of the era completely failed to monitor or mitigate. The sheer vulnerability of the Charlotte operation should not have been a surprise to anyone in regional management. A remarkably similar and massive security failure had occurred only 7 months prior, serving as a glaring alarm that was entirely ignored. In March of that same year, an armored car driver named Philip Noel Johnson executed the theft of $18,800,000 in Jacksonville, Florida. At that moment in time, it stood as the largest cash robbery in the history of the United States. Johnson managed to subvert the system as a solo driver, gaining access to nearly 1,000 pounds of high-denomination currency and successfully fleeing across the border to Mexico. The technical failures in Jacksonville mirrored the exact vulnerabilities that still existed in Charlotte. Both facilities suffered from a systemic failure in personnel vetting, massive solo oversight gaps, and a deeply flawed internal trust model. Loomis Fargo had essentially been handed a proof of concept for how their own systems could be dismantled from the inside, yet they changed nothing. Instead of prompting an urgent security overhaul, the Jacksonville heist served as dark inspiration. Inside the Charlotte break room, David Gant and his co-worker, Kelly Campbell, frequently discussed the details of the Florida robbery. What began as idle chatter about workplace grievances slowly morphed into actionable criminal planning. The corporate negligence that allowed the Florida disaster to happen was now actively fueling the blueprints for an even larger theft in North Carolina, building a mobile home syndicate. When people hear about a $17 million heist, they naturally picture an elite, highly coordinated international crime syndicate. You might envision shadowy figures in tailored suits, meticulous floor plans, and state-of-the-art evasion tactics being planned in a high-rise boardroom. The reality of the Loomis Fargo robbery shatters that Hollywood illusion completely. Instead of a sophisticated network of seasoned professionals, this massive criminal enterprise was conceptualized and assembled inside a double-wide trailer in rural North Carolina. The transition from a single disgruntled employee to a functional criminal cell required an external logistical framework. But the framework this group built was astonishingly fragile and constructed entirely on delusion. To pull off a crime of this magnitude, the insider needed a reliable connection to the outside world. This is exactly where Kelly Campbell stepped in. Having recently left her job at the Loomis Fargo facility, Campbell acted as the primary recruiter and the essential connective tissue bridging the gap between the vault and the streets. She understood the psychological vulnerability of David Gant and knew exactly who to bring into the fold to ignite this impending disaster. Campbell reached out to an old high school acquaintance named Steve Chambers. Almost immediately, Chambers assumed the commanding role of the mastermind. He presented himself to Gant as a highly sophisticated operator, with deep, dangerous ties to organized crime. In reality, the truth was far less intimidating and significantly more pathetic. Chambers was merely a petty criminal with a history of minor legal infractions, living out of a mobile home, yet possessing massive, unearned aspirations of grandeur. The entire planning phase was characterized by a bizarre, amateurish optimism that completely overlooked the extreme physical and financial challenges of moving and laundering millions of dollars in physical cash. The group built a conspiratorial hierarchy, founded on a fragile foundation of mutual distrust and deeply compartmentalized roles. When you examine the actual mechanics of their agreement, the staggering imbalance of power is almost unbelievable. David Gant was the sole individual with the security clearance and physical access required to execute the theft. He was the one manipulating the vault and doing the grueling heavy lifting. He was taking on 100% of the physical exertion and 100% of the immediate legal exposure. If the alarms tripped or the local police arrived, Gant would be the only one standing in the vault holding the bag. Despite shouldering absolutely all of the physical and legal risk, the entire plan hinged on Gant surrendering the vast majority of the stolen payload directly to Steve Chambers. Can you fathom the sheer absurdity of this arrangement? Gant was expected to hand over thousands of pounds of stolen currency to a man he barely knew, based entirely on blind trust and the desperate expectation of future loyalty. The arrangement dictated that Chambers would manage the illicit funds and send regular wire transfers to provide for Gant, while the vault supervisor remained in hiding across the border in Mexico. To handle the sheer volume of incoming cash, Steve relied heavily on his wife, Michelle Chambers, who essentially became the unofficial comptroller of the operation. Her primary responsibility was to provide a clean infrastructure for storage, manage the local bank deposits, and orchestrate the money laundering through various high-value asset purchases. The fundamental problem undermining their entire operation was that neither Steve nor Michelle had the slightest idea how the global financial system actually functioned. Their absolute ignorance regarding currency tracking, federal reporting requirements, and basic money laundering principles set the stage for their own destruction. They possessed a staggering level of hubris, genuinely believing they could effortlessly absorb millions of dollars in low-denomination bills into their daily lives without drawing the immediate and overwhelming attention of the federal government. The brutal physics of theft. People watch cinema and inherently believe stealing millions of dollars is a swift and elegant process. Pop culture trains the public to picture a sleek professional bypassing lasers and effortlessly dropping neatly banded stacks of $100 bills into a compact duffel bag. The brutal reality of taking hard currency is nothing like that at all. It is a back-breaking, deeply physical, and logistical hellscape. Money is not just an abstract idea. It is paper, it is cotton, it is ink, and in massive quantities, it is incredibly heavy. Has anyone ever truly considered the sheer tonnage of a fortune? When you decide to steal millions, you are no longer a glamorous mastermind. You suddenly become a desperate manual laborer, tasked with moving an industrial load under extreme psychological pressure. On the evening of October 4th, 1997, David Gant experienced this crushing physical reality firsthand. The window of opportunity opened between 6 and 7 o'clock at night inside the Charlotte Regional Vault. Utilizing his absolute authority as the vault supervisor, Gant simply looked at the trainee assigned to his shift and sent him home early. With a single administrative command, he secured solitary access to the massive concrete room. There were no elaborate hacking sequences or acrobatic maneuvers required. He was completely alone with the money, surrounded by towering pallets of cash. The real challenge was not getting into the vault, but figuring out how to survive the sheer physics of moving the payload out the door. To execute the theft, Gant had to engage in a feat of significant and grueling physical exertion. The target was roughly $17.3 million, but the true obstacle was the specific denomination. Over $11 million of that total consisted entirely of $20 bills. Thieves often target smaller bills to ensure the currency is unmarked and non-sequential, making it nearly impossible for federal authorities to trace. That tactical advantage comes with a massive volumetric penalty. Gant was forcing himself to manually move 2,800 pounds of currency. That equals 1.27 metric tons of dead weight. Could you deadlift a compact car by yourself? Imagine trying to do exactly that by rapidly hurling brick-sized bundles of paper while racing against the clock. Before fleeing the scene, Gant attempted to cover his tracks and obscure his identity by dismantling the surveillance system. He located the primary security desk and manually removed the recording tapes from 2 highly visible VCRs connected to the vault cameras. He believed he had successfully blinded the facility. He made a critical, irreversible oversight. He completely failed to account for a hidden third VCR locked away in a separate, discrete cabinet. This hidden machine dutifully recorded his every movement, capturing high-definition evidence of the ultimate betrayal. Sweating and exhausted, Gant finally managed to load the massive haul of cash into the back of a Loomis Fargo Ford Econoline van, slamming the heavy doors on his former life. He drove the company van away from the facility and headed straight for a rendezvous point at the Reynolds & Reynolds print shop in Northwest Charlotte. The rest of the conspiratorial crew was waiting for him, but their profound lack of planning immediately derailed the operation. They had severely underestimated the physical space required to transport that much loose paper. They brought multiple private vehicles and several 55-gallon industrial drums, frantically attempting to stuff the bundles of 20s into every available crevice. The sheer volume of the haul was entirely too much. They literally ran out of volumetric space. The physical bulk of the cash defeated their getaway plan. Faced with an impossible geometry problem, they made a desperate choice. They drove the company van into a wooded area less than 10 miles from the warehouse and simply abandoned it. Left sitting inside the cargo bay of that truck was approximately $3.3 million in cold, hard cash. They had successfully stolen a fortune, but their sheer logistical incompetence forced them to leave a mountain of it rotting in the Carolina woods. A flight to nowhere, fast. Imagine the pure, unadulterated adrenaline surging through your veins. You have just successfully pulled off the largest cash heist in American history. Your heart is pounding against your ribs, your getaway car is loaded, and you are racing toward the airport to execute your grand, multi-million-dollar escape. You arrive at the terminal, ready to vanish into the night, only to find the glass doors locked tight. The entire Columbia Metropolitan Airport in South Carolina is closed for the evening. A rudimentary logistical detail, checking the operating hours of your escape route, completely dismantled their grand exit strategy. It is baffling that individuals capable of moving mountains of cash failed to read a basic flight schedule. Faced with a locked terminal, panic set in. Kelly Campbell realized the immediate danger of standing around a dark airport with a wanted man and made a calculated decision to abandon the original plan. She returned to Charlotte, clocking back into her normal life to maintain a desperate semblance of a cover story. David Gant was left completely alone to navigate a chaotic, improvised escape. He climbed aboard a commercial bus bound for Atlanta, Georgia, and eventually managed to secure a flight out of New Orleans heading for Cozumel, Mexico. Out of the staggering $17 million he had just risked his entire life to steal, Gant carried a mere $50,000 across the border. He believed keeping his cash on hand relatively low would allow him to slip through international customs with minimal scrutiny. Landing in Cozumel, Gant immediately threw himself into a lifestyle of conspicuous, reckless luxury. He checked into the high-end Hotel La Tortuga, spending his days engaged in expensive recreational activities like scuba diving and parasailing over the crystal-clear waters. He lived like a king on an endless vacation, but $50,000 vanishes incredibly fast when you are paying premium tourist rates. The illusion of a permanent tropical paradise shattered quickly. Within months, the lavish resort life evaporated. Gant found himself rapidly running out of funds, isolated in a foreign country, and utterly dependent on Steve Chambers to wire him his promised share of the stolen fortune. As his isolation grew deeper, his communication with the conspirators back in North Carolina became frantic and desperate. Back in the States, the FBI was already closing the net. Federal agents were actively monitoring phone lines and intercepting pager messages, carefully analyzing every piece of intercepted data. Investigators repeatedly flagged a recurring numerical code flashing across the suspect pagers, the sequence 143. Law enforcement initially treated this as a highly sophisticated tactical cipher, perhaps a geographic coordinate or a complex drop-off signal. The reality of the code was far more pathetic and grounded in simple human emotion. It was nothing more than standard 90s pager shorthand for the phrase, "I love you," reflecting the deeply manipulative, romantic dynamic between Gant and Campbell that fueled the entire robbery. Paranoia eventually caught up with the fugitive. After a random tourist casually remarked that he bore a striking resemblance to the infamous Charlotte bank robber plastered all over the news, Gant panicked. He immediately shaved off his signature beard and drastically altered his physical appearance in a frantic attempt to hide in plain sight. All of those physical precautions were completely meaningless. His desperate need for cash forced him to continually use easily traceable communication channels, repeatedly calling and paging Chambers to beg for his cut of the money. He had successfully fled the country, but he had tethered himself directly to the very people leading authorities right to his door. The cardinal rule of theft. The absolute cardinal rule of stealing $17 million is incredibly simple. You must lay low. You have to fade completely into the background, maintain your previous boring lifestyle, and absolutely do not draw any financial attention to yourself for at least a full calendar year. Law enforcement is waiting for exactly this kind of mistake, watching for the sudden influx of cash into the local economy. It is the only way to survive the initial heat of a massive federal investigation. Can you imagine securing the score of a lifetime, only to immediately broadcast it to the authorities? The Chambers family treated that fundamental law of criminal survival as a minor, irritating suggestion to be completely ignored. While David Gant was rapidly running out of money and sweating in a foreign country, Steve and Michelle Chambers were back in North Carolina, orchestrating a spectacular, undeniable display of undisciplined wealth. They had sworn to lay low, yet the overwhelming temptation of having millions of dollars in physical cash sitting in 55-gallon drums proved to be entirely too much for them to handle. They immediately abandoned their double-wide mobile home in rural Lincoln County. They did not just quietly upgrade to a slightly nicer house in a modest neighborhood. Instead, they orchestrated a blindingly obvious leap across the socio-economic divide. They purchased a $635,000 luxury mansion situated inside the highly exclusive, heavily guarded Kramer Mountain Country Club. To make this real estate transaction even more glaring to federal investigators, they paid $437,000 of the purchase price using literal bundles of physical cash. Buying a luxury compound with dirty money was just the beginning of their staggering financial signatures. The physical items eventually seized by the FBI provided a perfect, glittering roadmap of the couple's complete lack of sophistication and insatiable need for immediate gratification. They began buying high-value assets that wildly contradicted their previous, deeply modest income brackets. A brand new BMW Z3 Roadster and a Chevrolet Tahoe suddenly appeared in the pristine driveway of their new mansion. They bought a $43,000 diamond ring and heavy, expensive Rolex watches, attempting to use high-end jewelry as a highly traceable form of money laundering. The reckless spending spree quickly infected their associates as well, with the Payne family utilizing thousands of dollars in stolen cash to pay for breast augmentations. The purchases that truly highlighted their psychological mindset were the items of pure kitsch. They spent $600 on a decorative wooden Indian. They adorned the walls of their newly acquired luxury estate with a velvet painting of Elvis Presley. They were projecting the exact behavioral profile of amateur thieves experiencing a sudden, massive influx of illicit funds, broadcasting their guilt to anyone paying attention. Their most catastrophic error had nothing to do with velvet paintings and everything to do with the federal banking system. The ultimate investigative breakthrough did not come from a brilliant wiretap or a complex forensic analysis of the crime scene. It came directly from Michelle Chambers walking into a local Nations Bank branch and exhibiting a level of staggering ignorance that continues to baffle law enforcement professionals today. She walked right up to a bank teller and directly asked how much cash she could deposit before the bank was legally required to report the transaction to the federal government. After the stunned teller explained the $10,000 limit, Michelle proceeded to make several consecutive deposits just barely under that federal threshold. To ensure the teller was completely put at ease, Michelle actively volunteered the highly suspicious, unprompted assurance that the massive stacks of low-denomination bills were definitely not drug money. No innocent person walks into a financial institution with thousands in loose 20s and randomly declares their innocence regarding narcotics trafficking. By attempting to circumvent federal law with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, she single-handedly triggered a cascade of suspicious activity reports. Those automated banking alerts bypassed all of their crude money laundering attempts and handed the FBI task force a direct, heavily documented roadmap right to their freshly painted front door. Paranoia breeds lethal violence. Up until this exact moment, the entire operation felt like a chaotic comedy of errors. A group of complete amateurs was bumbling their way through millions of dollars, buying absurd decorative statues and drawing the immediate attention of every single bank teller in the state. Suddenly, the narrative stops being funny and turns incredibly lethal. Unchecked greed inevitably breeds intense paranoia, and that deep paranoia always breeds violence. Steve Chambers was sitting inside his newly purchased luxury mansion, completely surrounded by stolen wealth, and he came to a chilling realization. David Gant was no longer his loyal partner across the border. Gant was a massive, walking liability. Chambers knew that if the authorities ever captured Gant in Mexico, the isolated vault supervisor would undoubtedly break under federal interrogation and reveal the names of every single co-conspirator back in North Carolina. Chambers decided that sending any more wire transfers was a total waste of resources. He decided to eliminate the risk permanently. Instead of sending the promised funds to his desperate accomplice, Chambers dispatched a killer. Enter Michael McKinney, a heavily trained former United States Marine who eagerly took on the role of the enforcer. McKinney was hired as a literal hitman, explicitly tasked with flying across the southern border, tracking down the isolated vault supervisor, and assassinating him in cold blood. The entire criminal conspiracy rapidly shifted from a colossal case of bank larceny into an active, terrifying murder-for-hire plot. By February of 1998, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already established heavily monitored, authorized wiretaps on the phone lines of both Chambers and Kelly Campbell. Agents were sitting in sterile rooms, listening to every single word, meticulously building their financial fraud case. Suddenly, the chatter on the line shifted away from reckless spending and focused on coordinating an international assassination. Hearing those specific conversations forced the federal agents to instantly and completely pivot their entire operational mandate. The primary mission was no longer about recovering $17 million in stolen currency. It immediately became a desperate, high-stakes race against the clock to save a human life. The tension escalating in the background was absolutely staggering to comprehend. Investigators were forced to secretly monitor Michael McKinney as he boarded a flight and traveled directly to Cozumel. They tracked him as he navigated the island, actively hunting a man who had completely isolated himself from the world. McKinney successfully located his target. The former Marine did not just spot Gaunt from a distance. In a twist of fate that completely defies logical explanation, the two men actually interacted right there on the white sand beach. Gaunt was entirely desperate for basic human connection and struck up a friendly conversation, completely unaware that the man he was befriending had been specifically sent to put a bullet in his head. Can you fathom the sheer psychological terror of sitting next to your own executioner, smiling and casually chatting under the Mexican sun, while federal agents listened to the entire lethal setup thousands of miles away? The federal task force realized they were completely out of time. They could not risk waiting another day to see if McKinney would hesitate or finally pull the trigger. The FBI initiated a frantic high-level coordination with the local Mexican police force. They had to orchestrate a precise tactical takedown on foreign soil before the hitman could finish his violent job. They swept in and successfully arrested David Gaunt, snatching him off the streets, not just to face federal justice, but to physically pull him out of the deadly crosshairs of his own conspirators, vaporized by the federal government. The house of cards does not just slowly tip over when the federal government finally decides to move. It gets absolutely vaporized in an overwhelming display of sudden force. You spend months thinking you have completely outsmarted the financial system and the most powerful law enforcement agencies on the planet. You convince yourself you are untouchable while lounging on a tropical beach surrounded by stolen wealth. Then, the crushing weight of reality kicks the door down. On March 1st, 1998, that reality violently caught up with David Gaunt. FBI agent Mark Rossi, flanked by a coordinated team of 5 Interpol officers, descended upon Playa del Carmen. They cornered the fugitive who had sparked the largest cash hunt in American history. What makes this exact moment so deeply fascinating is the overwhelming wave of profound relief that washed over the exhausted vault supervisor. Gaunt did not attempt to run. He did not fight back. He reportedly welcomed the federal agents with open arms. He had spent the last several weeks paralyzed by the terrifying realization that he was actively being hunted by his own criminal associates. Being placed in federal handcuffs was no longer his worst-case scenario. Surrendering to the authorities was literally the only way he was going to survive the week. The very next morning, on March 2nd, the FBI unleashed a massive, perfectly synchronized sweep back in North Carolina. Local authorities and federal task forces executed simultaneous raids across the state, taking the Chambers couple, Kelly Campbell, Michael McKinney, and several logistical facilitators into immediate custody. The entire conspiratorial network, a fragile cell built on blind trust and breathtaking arrogance, was entirely dismantled in less than 48 hours. The legal proceedings that followed were expansive and utterly devastating. Because the stolen physical cash legally belonged to federally insured banking institutions, the crime was immediately elevated to a massive federal offense of bank larceny. The judicial hammer swung down with incredible force, resulting in 24 total convictions for varying roles in the theft, the criminal conspiracy, and the sprawling money laundering operation. Steve Chambers, the mastermind who ordered a lethal hit on his own partner, received a heavy sentence of 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Michael McKinney, the former Marine hired to pull the trigger, received an identical sentence for his severe role in the murder-for-hire plot. The sentencing phase revealed a brilliant stroke of judicial irony that completely dismantled the original power dynamic of the group. Michelle Chambers, who never actually set foot inside the Loomis Fargo vault, was hit with a staggering sentence of 7 years and 8 months behind bars. Her punishment was made significantly harsher due to her blatant bond violations and frantic attempts to hide stolen assets from the government. Compare her absolute downfall to David Gaunt, the primary perpetrator who manually moved almost 3,000 pounds of stolen cash. He received a slightly lighter sentence of exactly 7.5 years. The actual thief walked away with less prison time than the arrogant comptroller who foolishly tried to manipulate the banking system. The federal prosecutors were not just satisfied with locking up the primary players in federal penitentiaries. They aggressively pursued total financial restitution, handing down orders that totaled millions of dollars, and completely bankrupting the primary conspirators for the rest of their natural lives. The government even went after the wider circle of collateral damage, specifically targeting the extended relatives and friends who had merely co-signed for the numerous bank-safe deposit boxes used to hide the bulk of the cash. The federal argument was brutal, uncompromising, and highly effective, firmly stating these family members should have reasonably known the sudden, massive influx of millions of dollars was entirely illicit. That highly aggressive legal strategy led to 13 additional convictions for money laundering alone, effectively destroying the lives and financial futures of absolutely anyone who dared to touch the stolen money. The missing $2 million. The federal government is not an institution you ever want auditing your personal life, especially when millions of stolen dollars are actively on the line. Once the arrests were made, the FBI transformed from a manhunt operation into a ruthlessly efficient financial recovery machine. They systematically dismantled the criminal empire the conspirators had so clumsily built, successfully recovering an astonishing 88 to 90% of the stolen $17.3 million. They executed massive search warrants across the entire state, drilling into safe deposit boxes to seize over $11 million in physical cash that had been frantically hidden by panicked relatives. The federal agents did not stop at simply recovering the loose bills. They foreclosed on that massive Kramer Mountain mansion and aggressively auctioned off every single luxury asset purchased with the stolen funds. They sold off Michelle Chambers' new BMW, the expensive jewelry, and yes, even that infamous velvet painting of Elvis Presley. Every single dollar generated from those federal auctions was painstakingly routed straight back to Lloyd's of London, the massive insurance conglomerate that was initially forced to cover the original catastrophic financial loss. You have to do the math on a recovery of that monumental scale. When the federal agents finally closed their ledgers and counted every seized asset, a glaring mathematical discrepancy remained permanently unresolved. Over $2 million is still missing to this very day. The prevailing theories regarding this massive shortfall paint a clear picture of sheer logistical chaos rather than criminal genius. A significant portion of that missing money evaporated into massive daily living expenses, covering the absurd cost of Gaunt funding a luxury resort lifestyle in Mexico and the initial, untraceable cash spending sprees of the Chambers family before they started buying real estate. Then you have the distinct possibility of hidden stashes. It is entirely plausible that smaller amounts of cash were quietly buried in the Carolina woods or tucked away by unidentified accomplices who simply refused to cooperate with federal authorities. There was also a staggering amount of sheer logistical waste. When you are frantically moving thousands of pounds of small bills in plastic barrels, physical damage is inevitable. Bills were used as crude markers, damaged in transport, or destroyed through pure incompetence, perfectly highlighted by the group somehow managing to ruin $20,000 worth of expensive cigars during their chaotic storage attempts. People naturally assume that the primary architect of a massive heist always manages to squirrel away a secret, untraceable retirement fund for when they finally get released from federal prison. The reality for David Gant completely destroys that Hollywood myth. If he had somehow managed to bury a piece of that missing $2 million, his current life would look vastly different. He is absolutely not sitting on a secret reserve of stolen wealth. Today, the man who once manually moved $17 million in an hour works a grueling job as a construction worker. He is currently drowning in insurmountable IRS debt, struggling to navigate the severe financial wreckage caused by his own colossal mistakes. The man who stood at the absolute center of the largest cash heist in American history is spending his days doing hard physical labor just to survive, proving conclusively that crime rarely pays the ultimate dividend. From felony to slapstick comedy, it is a profound twist of cultural memory that a massive federal crime involving $17 million and a highly monitored murder-for-hire plot eventually transformed into a slapstick comedy starring Zach Galifianakis. Think about the sheer gravity of those real-life events. The American public quickly branded this sprawling criminal enterprise the hillbilly heist. That enduring cultural perception, driven entirely by the absurd spending habits, the velvet paintings, and the profound lack of sophistication shown by the conspirators, ultimately culminated in the 2016 Hollywood film Masterminds. The movie takes the very real, highly dangerous fallout of the Charlotte robbery and uses it as a mere skeleton to prop up an absurdist, fictionalized comedy. The historical record demands a fierce, uncompromising defense against this specific Hollywood adaptation. The film intentionally modifies significant, deeply serious details purely to generate a cheap laugh. On the silver screen, the character based on David Gaunt is heavily portrayed as a bumbling, hopelessly incompetent nitwit who simply stumbles his way blindly through the regional vault. The factual reality of that October evening was entirely different and far more physically intense. The real David Gaunt was a disciplined Gulf War veteran who understood chain of command and logistical execution. While his moral compass was undeniably corrupted by greed and manipulation, he executed an incredibly complex tactical theft. He successfully endured an agonizing feat of endurance, moving over 2,800 pounds of small denomination currency entirely by himself in under an hour. That is absolutely not the work of a bumbling fool, but rather the grim, sweating determination of a truly desperate man pushing his body to the absolute limit. The cinematic adaptation also takes the terrifying reality of the assassination plot and aggressively reduces it to a series of slapstick errors and goofy misunderstandings. The on-screen hitman is depicted as a bumbling assassin who continually fails his lethal mission due to sheer comedic incompetence. That lighthearted portrayal completely and utterly erases the suffocating lethal danger that Michael McKinney brought to the shores of Cozumel. The real McKinney was a highly trained former Marine, actively hunting an isolated, highly vulnerable man on a foreign beach. He created a life-or-death crisis so severe that it forced the Federal Bureau of Investigation to immediately abandon their massive, multi-million-dollar financial investigation just to launch a desperate international rescue mission. There was absolutely nothing funny about federal agents frantically coordinating with foreign police forces, racing against the ticking clock to prevent a brutal execution from happening right there in the sand. The ultimate, lingering irony of this Hollywood adaptation involves the actual perpetrator of the crime. David Gaunt himself actively served as a direct consultant for the film production. He provided the directors and actors with intimate, first-hand insights into the mechanical workings of the Loomis Fargo vault, the specific pager codes used, and the severe emotional toll of the entire sprawling conspiracy. He handed them the authentic blueprint for their blockbuster comedy. Yet, the man who provided the foundational truth for a major motion picture never saw a single dime for his extensive professional contributions. Due to the massive, outstanding federal restitution orders still hanging over his life, the justice system legally barred him from receiving any financial compensation for his involvement in telling his own infamous story. The invisible human threat. Decades have passed since those millions of dollars vanished into the Carolina woods. Today, the armored transportation industry has completely revolutionized its physical infrastructure. The heavy steel vaults are heavily upgraded with biometric scanners. The analog surveillance tapes have been replaced by pristine digital cameras streaming directly to the cloud, and the internal tracking systems are incredibly advanced. You might assume that all of those modern technological marvels actually make the money impenetrable. The truth is much darker. The fundamental vulnerability of the entire financial system remains exactly the same today as it was in the autumn of 1997. The human element never changes. The primary conspirators responsible for the most absurd cash robbery in American history have all eventually returned to normal society. David Gaunt walked out of a federal penitentiary on parole after serving just 5 years for his monumental betrayal. The man who once lived a fleeting life of luxury in a Mexican resort town has since established a quiet, grueling life, working construction down in Jacksonville, Florida. He has openly reflected on the severe lessons learned from the heist, plainly admitting that it took the harsh reality of a federal cell block for him to realize he used to be an absolute bag of worms. Steve Chambers, The arrogant mastermind who ordered a lethal hit on his own partner finally finished his lengthy sentence in 2006. He has largely avoided the public eye ever since his release, casually describing his current status to the world as a retired criminal. Getting out of a federal penitentiary does not mean you actually escape the crushing weight of the United States government. The financial aftermath of their staggering greed continues to ruin their lives through relentless restitution and aggressive tax collection. Federal law generally caps government collection efforts at 20 years post-prison release. This means these individuals have spent the last 2 decades handing over almost everything they earn back to the very institutions they tried to destroy. For some of the conspirators, like Kelly Campbell, that agonizing 20-year collection window is just finally set to expire in late 2024. Others, including Steve Chambers, will remain permanently chained to the federal books until 2026. They thought they stole a permanent fortune, but they actually bought themselves a lifetime of insurmountable debt.